So where does it start? Workers organized before the Civil War in some of those garment towns up in New England and other areas. But as we have a national economy in this post-Civil War era, as we have a national economy in this period of American Industrial Revolution, we see national labor organizations, or national unions really, forming. The first national labor organization is the National Labor Union, organized by William Sylvis in 1866. It's not a major contributor to change in the labor movement, in part because their goals are entirely too idealistic. They talk about things like workers owning their own businesses. And it's not long before the Knights of Labor emerge as the dominant national force in labor. It started out as Philly garment workers in 1868. In 1878, Terence Powderly took them from a secret organization to a public organization. Now, opposed to other groups that we'll talk about, the Knights of Labor were a very welcoming, a very open labor organization. They allowed women to join. They had 60,000 African American workers as part of the Knights of Labor. The only people that were excluded were non-producers. So bankers, lawyers, liquor dealers, we see that temperance movement still having some influence, gamblers. All these people were the only people really excluded. Even employers, the owners of factories, could join the Knights of Labor. This really shows how non-radical the Knights of Labor were. And it shows one of their policies. They're kind of opposed to using strikes. They talked about mostly lofty goals as well, utopian ideas of workers owning the means of production. But they did have a few concrete ideas that they supported. They supported an 8-hour workday. They opposed child labor. Their goal, their ideal is make each man his own employer. But the Knights of Labor is going to fall out of favor with the public as a result of some failed strikes and then some violence that they're blamed for. This really leads to public opposition of the Knights of Labor, public opposition of unions, and public oppositions of the labor movement. And the Knights of Labor are done as a national organization by 1895. They're succeeded, though, in 1886 by the American Federation of Labor. This is a different type of organization. It is a loose alliance of national craft unions. It's more of kind of a confederacy. So local craft unions, all the plumbers or all the steel workers or all the bakers in one town, might join together to form a local union, and then those local unions join together to form this national organization known as the American Federation of Labor. And it was led by Samuel Gompers. And Gompers and the American Federation of Labor are only interested, they're only accepting skilled workers. Gompers and the AFL is a much more practical organization. They recognized that capitalism was here to stay in America and that the working class people will stay workers. That's why Gompers' goal is summed up here. He wanted to increase the working man's welfare year by year. He's going to take a pragmatic approach to the challenges that labor faces. This is why his ideas are sometimes called bread and butter unionism. He's fighting for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions for AFL workers. And Gompers and the AFL are willing to use a workers' strike. They're willing to call for a boycott on a company if their demands are not met. Now, they're going to ask for limited and reasonable gains, and if ownership is compliant and cooperative and works with labor, well, then they can enjoy the benefits of a stable labor force. If not, then those workers might go on strike. In terms of some of the other economic issues of the day, the AFL is okay with business monopolies. The AFL is okay with trusts, as long as those types of corporations are fair to their workers. By the 1890s, this is the most important national labor group in the country. Over 1/3 of the skilled laborers in the country are part of the AFL at one time or another before World War I. Now, most workers in the country were not part of the union, or any union, but the AFL is still a powerful national entity. But it's not that inclusive. The AFL ignored and opposed women membership. So only 2 of those smaller local unions that made up the AFL, only 2 of hundreds of them allowed women to join. And in 1910, less than 2% of women workers, and many women were working, less than 2% of those female workers are in unions. Many African Americans are not admitted to the AFL. Some of them were blocked by initiation fees, which might have been set unreasonably high for the lower paid African American workers. They might have been unfairly blocked by unfairly administered examinations, similar to those literacy tests we saw that disenfranchised African Americans in the South. So what happens with labor and ownership? Employers viewed labor at this time the same way they viewed any other resource. Capitalists, entrepreneurs, business owners need to bring together resources. They bring together raw materials like lumber and oil and iron. They bring together electricity or water power or whatever. They have factories where this work gets done. And labor is just one of those resources that you add to the pie to make that finished product. So, like any other resource, factory owners really thought that supply and demand, the market forces, would be good enough to determine wages. If one factory owner doesn't pay his workers enough, those workers will leave and go somewhere where they're treated better. They're not concerned with the welfare of their workers. And if workers are found to be joining unions, they were almost immediately fired. Factory owners are more than willing to use temporary workers, temporary non-union workers, known as scabs by union employees, to replace workers on strikes. And one of the favorite methods of breaking a strike that factory owners employed was known as the court injunction. So when workers went on strike, the factory owner would go to court and get that strike declared illegal. It would bar the workers from picketing in front of the factory. It might even force them back on their job, or else they could be fired. That's what happened in the Pullman strike in Pullman, Illinois, where employees at the Pullman Palace Car Factory went on strike. That strike was broken by an injunction. The union leaders were banned from supporting any of the efforts, and the workers were told, you go back to work or you're out of a job. The Supreme Court is not helpful to labor at this time. In 1895, in a Supreme Court case regarding Eugene Debs, they ruled that those injunctions, the enemy of the strike, the injunction was a legal tool that could be used by factory owners. And in Lochner versus New York, the Supreme Court declared that a state could not put limits on hours that an employee could work. Now, this might sound good. That's going to limit hours that people have to work. But what this means is that employers can now force workers to work long, arduous hours with no overtime pay. All of this means in the late 1800s, really from 1880 to 1900, the United States has more labor violence than any other country in the world at that time. For those 20 years, there are over 23,000 strikes. That's over 1,000 strikes a year. There are over 6.5 million workers that at one point in just that 20-year span go on strike. Some of the most significant strikes: the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It's predominantly railroad workers out west. This strike closes railroads across the country, and over 100 workers were killed. Eventually, federal troops, the U.S. Army, has to be called in to break up this strike. In 1886, in Haymarket Square, Chicago, the Knights of Labor were holding a rally, and anarchists, people who wanted to get rid of the government, set off bombs that killed some police officers. Police officers fired on the crowd. Some of the workers, 4 workers, were killed. And this event, in many Americans' minds, links the labor movement with radicalism. And it really weakens the national labor movement. It kills the Knights of Labor. And across the country, city police forces are strengthened out of fear of rioting and striking workers. In fact, in Chicago, wealthy industrialists donate money to have not 1, but 2 military bases built in the city for protection. The mining industry was no stranger to labor unrest. In 1892, federal troops put down a silver miners' strike in Idaho. There are also bloody strikes in Colorado. But probably one of the most famous strikes was also in 1892 at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Factory right outside Pittsburgh. Carnegie and his business partner Henry Frick cut the wages of their steel mill employees 20%. And the local union, Amalgamated Steel and Iron Workers, which was part of the AFL, went on strike because of this wage cut. And they surrounded the steel mill to try to prevent scabs from going in and working their jobs. So Frick, running the factory for Carnegie, hired a private army of Pinkerton security agents to drive off the striking workers. 13 people were killed. This is Americans killing Americans. The state militia is eventually called in to put down the strike, and the mill is reopened, and the strikers have to give up and accept lower wages. But violence like this leaves many Americans wondering, what is the cost of industrialization, and is it really worth it?